B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, September 24th, 2020. Your humble host will be away tomorrow on a short business trip to Southern California, and I'll be back here with a fresh podcast for you on Monday. So, in another one of those disarming moments, Donald Trump has telegraphed to the world his intention to monkey with the November 3rd election and then cling to power by refusing to accept an outcome that is not favorable to him. And this is something we have been speculating about. I have to say that Bill Maher has been asking this question for over a year. Will Trump yield if he is defeated? And at first I said, come on, Bill, you're giving him ideas. What are you bringing that up for? But it really seems to have blossomed in the mind of the stable genius. And yesterday at a White House news event, Trump was asked by a reporter from Playboy magazine the question that is on so many people's minds.
Will you commit here today for a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
But people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it, and you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
So that's typical Trump projection. It's the Democrats who know that the system is rigged and gamed and that the use of widespread absentee ballot or mail-in voting is somehow going to disadvantage Trump. And while it is fair to say that more Democrats have signed up for the 70 million or so vote-by-mail ballots so far, there are Trump voters who are going to vote by mail too. Trump himself is going to vote by mail. And so this is a smokescreen. And Trump is tipping his hand here, saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to hold on to power no matter what. And he's laid the groundwork, as we've been pointing out here recently, particularly to his Twitter followers and cult members, that the only way he can lose is if the Democrats steal it from him. And as we will detail here, we know that most of the schemes to game the election happen on the Republican side. So it's interesting because these comments and a couple of articles that I'm about to cite for you have prompted a national discussion and serious concern. And even Republicans like Mitch McConnell, while they don't poke the bear by contradicting Trump by name or directly, on Twitter today, McConnell wrote, the winner of the November 3rd election will be inaugurated on January 20th. There will be an orderly transition just as there has been every 4 years since 1792. Mitt Romney, fundamental to democracy is the peaceful transition of power. Without that, there is Belarus. And we'll get to Belarus a little bit later. Any suggestion that a president might not respect his constitutional guarantee is both unthinkable and unacceptable. Marco Rubio, as we've done for over 2 centuries, will have a legitimate and fair election. And even Lindsey Graham is saying that you can count on him. People wonder about the peaceful transfer of power, said Graham. I can assure you it will be peaceful. I promise you as a Republican, if the Supreme Court decides that Joe Biden wins, I will accept the result. The court will decide, and if Republicans lose, we'll accept the result. Oh, sure, Lindsey. Your words as good as, well, bullshit. And as you may know, Trump added to the issue that he wants 9 justices on the Supreme Court. That's why he is rushing the nomination of his secret candidate for the seat of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the reveal kind of like a gender reveal because he's already promised it's a female, is going to occur on Saturday, we're told. And Trump's declaration that this is going to the Supreme Court without even knowing what the outcome might be, what percentage of ballots will be counted on election night. He is signaling that he is going to use every available tool and lever to hold on to power. And as he has just careened all over the road, running over all kinds of logical obstacles, he has signaled very clearly that that is his intention. Nancy Pelosi, you are not in North Korea. You're not in Turkey. You're in the United States of America. It's a democracy, so why don't you just try for a moment to honor your oath to the Constitution of the United States? And we get a quote from Julian Zelizer. He is a professor of American history at Princeton. The more he makes these arguments, the more he normalizes the fact that this can be part of the conversation. Even if meant to distract, these are powerful words to come from a president. He's clearly accelerating his effort to set up a challenge to an outcome that is unfavorable to him. And, of course, these representations by Republicans, I have similar quotes from Shelby of Alabama, Liz Cheney of Wyoming. They can't be believed at all, because they'll find some rationalization to change their tune as soon as Trump orders them to. And this is a real risk to what's left of our participatory republic. It's not really a democracy, we know that. And at The Atlantic, an article by Barton Gellman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning former reporter for The Washington Post. He's been a guest on this show. He wrote a lengthy story, The Election That Could Break America. And this has the chattering class uptight and on the edge of its proverbial seat. He writes, the danger is not merely that the 2020 election will bring discord. Those who fear something worse take turbulence and controversy for granted. The coronavirus pandemic, a reckless incumbent, a deluge of mail-in ballots, a vandalized postal service, a resurgent effort to suppress votes, and a trainload of lawsuits are bearing down on the nation's creaky electoral machinery. Anything is possible, including a landslide that leaves no doubt on election night. But even if one side takes a commanding early lead, tabulation and litigation of the, quote, overtime count, millions of mail-in and provisional ballots, could keep the outcome unsettled for days or weeks. And we don't know if Trump is using depends, but I believe he will shit his pants if he can't claim victory within at least 48 hours of the closing of the polls. He wants to do it before midnight Eastern on election night. But it's very clear. I just referenced 71 million mail-in ballots have been asked for. And we know that in some states the law prevents the election offices from counting those votes until after the polls have closed. We now have revised deadlines in North Carolina and elsewhere for when those mail-in ballots need to be received in order to qualify, to be considered valid. Back to Bart Gellman. The worst case, however, is not that Trump rejects the election outcome. The worst case is that he uses his power to prevent a decisive outcome against him. If Trump sheds all restraint, and if his Republican allies play the parts he assigns them, he could obstruct the emergence of a legally unambiguous victory for Biden in the Electoral College and then in Congress. He could prevent the formation of consensus about whether there is any outcome at all. He could seize on that uncertainty to hold on to power. Trump's state and national legal teams are already laying the groundwork for post-election maneuvers that would circumvent the results of the vote count in battleground states. Ambiguities in the Constitution and logic bombs, I love that, in the Electoral Count Act make it possible to extend the dispute all the way to Inauguration Day, which would bring the nation to a precipice. Because he speculates that at noon on January 20th, 2 men could show up to be sworn in, and one of them would arrive with all of the tools and power of the presidency already in hand. And that same professor I quoted a moment ago, Julian Zelizer from Princeton, quote, "We are not prepared for this at all. We talk about it, some worry about it, we imagine what it would be, but few people have actual answers to what happens if the machinery of democracy is used to prevent a legitimate resolution to the election." Gelman turns to the lame duck period after the election and up to Inauguration Day. It's 79 days. And a lot can happen. One of the operative deadlines is December 14th, when the electors are scheduled to meet in all 50 states. The next deadline is the 3rd of January, when the electors meet. I'm sorry, the 3rd of January is when the new Congress is seated, and then the 6th of January, when the House and Senate meet jointly for a formal count of the electoral vote. Later, Gelman writes, Trump may win or lose, but he will never concede, not under any circumstance, not during the 79-day period, not afterward. If compelled in the end to vacate his office, Trump will insist from exile as long as he draws breath that the contest was rigged. Gelman continues, Trump's supporters aren't the only people who think extra-constitutional thoughts aloud. Trump has been asked directly, and we just heard the clip, whether he'll respect the election results. To Chris Wallace on Fox News in August, actually it was in July, sorry, Trump said, what I'm saying is that I'll tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense, okay? I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no. So this kind of chaos and confusion is the smokescreen that he hopes to use to steal the process, to game it, so that he can claim that he is going to serve a second term under whatever dubious claims, and his mob of supporters who've been practicing at his campaign rallies all across the country, many of them will grab their guns and seek to enforce Trump's will and impose it on the rest of us. John Cassidy, writing at the New Yorker's website, one thing you can't accuse Trump of is trying to disguise his nefarious intentions. For months now, legal experts and Democratic campaign officials have warned that he may reject the results of the election and pronounce himself the victor regardless of the vote. On Tuesday, Trump virtually confirmed that this is his plan. He also indicated that rushing through the appointment of another conservative to the Supreme Court is a key element of his strategy to stay in the White House. We need 9 justices. You need that. With the unsolicited millions of ballots that they're sending, it's a scam. It's a hoax. Everybody knows that. And the Democrats know it better than anybody else. I mean, that's similar to what you just heard in the clip, but it's something he said on a different occasion. The ballots Trump refers to are mail-in forms that many states, like Florida, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are using this year to make it easier and safer for people to vote. Surveys indicate Democratic voters are far more likely to use mail-in ballots than Republicans. But as I've pointed out, many Republicans will use them. And he's shooting himself in the foot or somewhere further up, in my view. But of course, the outcome of the actual balloting doesn't appear to be his focus. And here's another quote. You're going to need 9 justices up there. I think it's going to be very important because what they're doing is a hoax with the ballots. They're sending out tens of millions of ballots, unsolicited. Not where they're being asked, but unsolicited, and that's a hoax, and you're going to need to have 9 justices. Now, I would argue that he said it's going to be a female. Whoever Madam Justice is who's put up on the court should, but won't, need to recuse herself. because the proximity of her appointment, confirmation, and then weighing issues related to the president who appointed her, that's a clear conflict of interest. But I'm old-fashioned. That doesn't matter anymore. Now Trump is, I'm reading here from Sullivan's piece again. I'm sorry, his name's Cassidy, John Cassidy. Now Trump is trying to delegitimize a presidential election. He's doing it in plain sight, and he's dragging the Supreme Court into the mire with him. And, of course, those spineless Republicans in the Senate, they'll make these, comments about how we're going to have a smooth and regular transition. But when he says jump, they will. So we are in a very strange period that's getting even stranger. And it is just so remarkable that Trump can't operate in a stealth mode. He is just so compulsive. And his need as a narcissist to be the center of attention, to pose as an authoritarian would-be dictator, that overtakes his own schemes and those of the toadies around him. And I have coined a new phrase, toadiest. Those are his GOP allies, and they are the toadiest of all toads. I want to recommend a piece that I've linked to in today's show file for this podcast. David Sirota has rebranded his newsletter, TMI, and is now calling it the Daily Poster, and teaming up with Andrew Perez, who was on this podcast a couple of months ago. They write, a warning to Democrats. Capitulation will not halt Trump's coup. And they open this way. When a dictator sees weakness, the dictator tries to increase his own power, which is exactly what Trump has done over the last 24 hours. After Democrats spent the weekend signaling surrender on the Supreme Court vacancy and suggesting they have no appetite to fight over the judiciary or threaten to expand the court, Trump on Wednesday declared that he may not agree to a peaceful transfer of power, and he openly admitted he's trying to rush through a judicial nominee so the court can give him a second term. He suggested he will get rid of the ballots. There won't be a transfer, there'll be a continuation. You heard that. And Sirota and Perez continue, this is a crime in process. Specifically, a coup that will be engineered remotely by Zoom as Republican lawmakers now plan to leave Washington without passing a pandemic relief bill and return only for votes to install a new Supreme Court justice to throw the election. And they slam the Democrats for their culture of learned helplessness. It's no match for authoritarianism, they say. If opposition party lawmakers don't stop imagining a return to normalcy and brunch, and if millions of Democratic voters don't start immediately demanding that their party's leaders begin fighting to stop Trump's court pick right away, then whatever is left of American democracy is probably finished. And they criticize Nancy Pelosi for ending the threat of a government shutdown by passing a budget bill in the House, a funding bill that would go into effect next week on October 1st. Quoting again from the article, when Schumer was subsequently shamed by AOC into using at least some of the procedural power at his disposal, preventing the Senate from holding committee hearings on Tuesday afternoon, Maggie Hassan, the senator of New Hampshire, issued a statement that she was extremely frustrated that today's hearing on defending state and local entities from cyber threats will have to be rescheduled. Dianne Feinstein is saying that she will not blow up the filibuster rule. Dick Durbin is saying that it's only speculative, the idea that Democrats, if they were in power, would expand the number of justices on the court to try to balance it. They quote Michael Bennet, a failed presidential candidate, the senator from Colorado, a Democrat, who apologized for his vote to end the filibuster on judicial nominees under the Supreme Court level back in 2013. This is not a time for apologies. Not when the Republicans are using full muscle, full bluster, and a whole lot of lies, ignoring their own precedential words. And the Democrats, I believe, are being too polite. I think that commentary is quite accurate. At the Washington Post, Aaron Blake apparently has been paying attention to the president's mob rallies. I've given up. And he reports that recently, Trump is getting even uglier in the rants that he issues from the podium. Recently, he's amped up his attacks on refugees, on Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, making fun of her birth nation of Somalia, attacking the members of the squad because they're rich targets for his right-wing followers. In Minnesota last week, he referred to internet rumors that Congresswoman Omar had married her brother. That's not true. Did she marry her brother, he asked. Where is that writer that writes? That writer should be given the Pulitzer. Every family in Minnesota needs to know about Sleepy Joe's extreme plan to flood your state with an influx of refugees from Somalia and from other places all over the planet. One of the most vital issues in this election, Trump says, is the subject of refugees. You know it. You know it perhaps better than almost anybody. Lots of luck. You having a good time with your refugees? In Pittsburgh, he slammed Omar, saying she's telling us how to run our country. How did you do where you came from, he says. How is your country doing? So these are... I was going to say thinly veiled, but they're not veiled. These are direct racist comments. And he knows it. His followers should know it. And they have descended into a new level of dark politics in this country. And I mentioned Belarus in that quote from Mitt Romney. Well, as you know, protesters have been in the streets for 7 weeks, and yesterday, strongman Alexander Lukashenko had a secret inauguration. He took the oath, and at the same time, the U.S. State Department said it no longer considers Lukashenko to be the president of the country any longer. The United States, quote, cannot consider Alexander Lukashenko the legitimate elected leader of Belarus. The U.S. does not believe the August 9th presidential elections in Belarus were free or fair. The announced results were fraudulent and did not convey legitimacy. Now, I side with the protesters, their desire to throw off Lukashenko. But here in the West, we don't have any real evidence one way or the other about the legitimacy of the election. We weren't concerned about the way he was reelected to his previous term, because we've been cozy with this strongman for a long time. And I'm just wondering if the State Department's move there is to prime the befuddled minds of many Americans, particularly the MAGA crowd, that, hey, if Belarus can have an illegitimate election, so can the United States. Meanwhile, reaction nationwide was very strong last night to the miscarriage of justice announced in Louisville, Kentucky, in the grand jury results related to the police killing of Breonna Taylor last March in a no-knock raid. And as we covered yesterday, the decision not to bring charges against the cops for killing Breonna Taylor, even a manslaughter charge. They were just washed away because her boyfriend had fired a single shot at the invaders of their apartment who were in plainclothes and, he says, did not announce themselves as cops. And this is grossly unfair. And it led to, I do not rationalize or condone this, but police have charged 26-year-old Lorenzo Johnson as the suspect in the shooting of 2 police officers during the protests on the streets of Louisville last night. The officers do not have life-threatening injuries. One was shot in the leg, and he's been released. The other was receiving treatment for a shot in the abdomen and was expected to get some surgery. Now, this raises the question. Is Trump going to send his palace guard into Louisville, Kentucky to impose order and to heighten his law and order message? Well, we'll wait and see. So across the country, in Los Angeles, people gathered in front of the Hall of Justice, in Dallas, outside the police department, in Minnesota, at the Capitol. Thousands marched through the streets of New York, including a group in Brooklyn. As many as 2,000 crossed the bridge there into Manhattan. St. Paul, Minnesota, Diamond Reynolds, the girlfriend of the late Philando Castile, who was fatally shot by a cop in 2016, spoke at a rally outside the Capitol. In Denver, they arrested a man they say drove a car into a protest near the state Capitol building. On Chicago's South Side, a couple of hundred people gathered, using a gallon of fake blood to spell Breonna in the middle of an intersection. In Atlanta, the Georgia Department of Public Safety used less lethal gas on unruly protesters who ignored orders not to climb onto a SWAT vehicle. In Buffalo, New York, a pickup truck drove through a group of protesters. There's kind of a pattern developing there. And in Milwaukee, 50 people gathered on a street corner for a candlelight vigil. Now in Portland, which has been the scene of nightly protests, they took a couple of nights off because of the thick smoke from the wildfires, but they were back on the streets last night in honor of Breonna Taylor. And the report from the Oregonian is that the crowd pelted officers with fire, rocks. At least 3 Molotov cocktails were launched. Police called it a riot. 13 people were arrested. In Seattle, there was a protest as well. Crowds of angry, heartbroken demonstrators gathered in 2 locations, one at Westlake Park downtown and the other on Capitol Hill, where the CHOP was operative back in June. 13 arrests in Seattle. And there is one incident that occurred where a police officer who has been referred to the Watchdog Police Accountability Office is accused of rolling his bicycle. Now, he was not on the bike, he was pushing a bike. And he reportedly rolled the front wheel of his bike over a protester who was lying down in the street. A video shows him rolling the front and back tires of the bike over the head and neck of the fallen protester. The officer then uses his bike as a ram, a battering ram. He slams it into another protester while 2 other cops behind him crouch toward the man that he had put, tire marks on. And a witness who captured it on video and posted it on Facebook, Joey Weiser, said, "I just watched a Seattle police officer run over a protester's head with a bicycle tonight, and for no apparent reason other than to be cruel." And in the video, Weiser can be heard yelling, "That officer ran over that person's head with their bicycle wheel." The cops are not learning, are they? They're arrogant, and they are committed to their gross behavior. Colin Kaepernick, former 49ers quarterback who took a knee, he said, "The white supremacist institution of policing that stole Breonna Taylor's life from us must be abolished for the safety and well-being of our people." That's a strong statement. But this is a serious problem. Because cops kill, on average, it's been very consistent the last 5 years, about 1,000 people every year. And I've linked to the Washington Post's graphic depiction of the latest data going back to 2015 when they voluntarily decided to start keeping track of the number of people killed by police officers every year. The FBI does not tally that kind of data. They're not interested. So this is a graphically rich piece, and when you peruse it, you will see that while about half of the victims of police shootings and killings are white, African Americans are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans, and Hispanics are killed by police also at a disproportionate rate. So here are the numbers. The number of people who are white killed by police last year amounted to 13 per million. Hispanics, 24 per million. Blacks, 32 per million. 95% are male. More than half of the victims are between 20 and 40 years old. The states with the highest rates of shootings are New Mexico, Alaska, and Oklahoma. Meanwhile, in Portland, they're bracing for twin protests on Saturday because the Proud Boys are coming to Portland. They're holding a rally near the Columbia River. And as the Seattle Times notes, it's interesting, the Oregonian didn't have an article about the Proud Boys coming to Portland, but the Seattle Times did. Anyway, in the voice of the Times, the Proud Boys have a reputation for brawling with anti-fascists, or Antifa, and they've billed the event to showcase the group's love for American and Western values. Portland Antifa activists and others have been monitoring the Proud Boys' Saturday plans. They've called for their own rally Saturday with music, food, and speeches in another park about 4 miles away. Mayor Ted Wheeler, who is struggling to win re-election in November, he lashed out at the Proud Boys. Quote, "Some in these groups and many who associate with them embody and empower racism, intolerance, and hate. Those are not Portland values, and they are not welcome. We are working with a wide variety of partners from around the region and the state to keep our community safe this weekend." Back in Washington, D.C., Speaker Pelosi has changed her tune a little bit. She shifted course and ordered her committee chairs to prepare a new COVID relief package that she said would be about $2.4 trillion. And she didn't specify who would get a bailout, but she talked about the urgent needs arising from the restaurant and airline industries. And she's been holding the line on her package called the HEROES Act that was passed way back in May and has never been addressed by the Senate in any manner. And so, once again, she is trying to spark a new round of negotiations to see if they can get something passed before they adjourn for the election and the distraction, of course, of the Supreme Court confirmation process over in the Senate. Pelosi's opponent for re-election here in San Francisco and the guest on our recent in-depth interview podcast, Shahid Buttar, has decided to use his ballot statement that gets distributed to all voters to dramatize what he calls the whiteout that his campaign has faced and that has silenced his voice. And he refers to that as a media whiteout. He's a person of color, so that's the reason for that framing. But he also says, quote, "As a grassroots candidate running against an established incumbent, I've experienced a whiteout of my voice from the moment I entered the race, ranging from the incumbent's refusal to debate, suggestions from political consultants to whitewash my appearance and grooming, a lack of due process from local clubs following unfounded accusations, and either a denial of press coverage in some cases or downright misrepresentation and failure to correct the knowingly false information in others." And at the request of a loyal listener and subscriber, Ford Green, I have lifted the paywall on the Shahid Buttar interview In an exchange of texts last night, he really hit me hard. He compared me to Bob Woodward for holding back on Trump's lies about COVID-19 that were finally published in his book earlier this month. Now, I do resent that, of course. But hey, we're getting close to the election, and I would rather, as many people hear from Nancy Pelosi's leftist opponent, than leave it behind the paywall until, the 14 days are up. I am posting a fresh in-depth interview today with Professor Peter Laufer from the University of Oregon. He's a longtime colleague of mine, and he invited me to interview him for a bookstore event that we did virtually for Village Books in Bremerton, Washington. And Laufer discusses his new book called Up Against the Wall, The Case for Opening the Mexican-American Border. And he makes a compelling case that the Mexican border should be no different from the Canadian border. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Peter Laufer.
The very reason I'm running as a Democrat against the party leader is precisely to help shift the party's direction. I'd say that there is a wide spectrum of voices within the party. Representative Ocasio-Cortez has made this point that in no other country would someone like her and someone like Joe Biden be lumped together in the same party. It's frankly absurd that, someone as conservative as Joe Biden shares the same party with voices like ours. And at the same time, there is basically an ongoing fight going on within and across the country over, are we going to be a Democratic Party more like Joe Biden, one that defers to the past and doubles down on many of our failed predatory corporate policies and engineers future crises, or are we going to be a party that leans into the transformative vision offered by the Squad that puts communities before corporations, that puts sustainability before resource extraction and plunder, that puts future generations before the greed of the present, and that puts people before capital. Ultimately, I think that's the vision that America needs. And it's one that we can achieve, certainly not through the Democratic Party as it's currently constituted, but if we knock out some figureheads and send signals to the rest of the party. And one signal I aim to send to the party is that if you are an urban centrist Democrat and you don't show up for your communities will show you the door. And if we are able to remove the strongest corporate Democrat in the entire body, I think that signal will be one that the rest of them will be very hard pressed to ignore.
That's Peter Laufer talking about his new book, Up Against the Wall, where he makes the case for opening up the U.S.-Mexican border. And while I'm speaking of books and authors, I want to note that Cynthia Levinson and her husband, Professor Sanford Levinson, the law professor, have been a guest on this podcast several times, and they published a book called Fault Lines in the Constitution. It now has a fresh edition aimed at younger readers in graphic novel form. And it's beautifully produced. It helps explain all of the procedures. It's essentially a breakdown of the Constitution and a civics book, all in one colorful package. And I just want to recommend it, particularly if you know a younger person who wants to get up to speed on the existing rules of our political system. Well, I can highly recommend it. And every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. And today I want to thank Susan Gavet, Jim Garrison, Carl Howard, and Clifford Johnson. They each chip in $5 to $20 a month to support the effort here, and you can do it too. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, I've had many conversations here about the Durham investigation. That is the look at the origins of the Russiagate investigation. And as you know, I don't buy the Mueller report. I don't buy the Democratic and media claims that Russia meddled in our 2016 election in any meaningful way. And fundamentally, I reject the claim that Russian agents hacked the DNC and gave the spoils to WikiLeaks. We know that that is not proven. So I have these mixed feelings about the Durham investigation because it was launched by Bill Barr, who is the most partisan appointee in the Trump cabinet, and he handpicked John Durham, and because Dennehy, what is her first name? Nora Dennehy, left the Durham investigation without explaining why. Democrats are asking for an investigation. And the New York Times is defending its investment in the Russiagate narrative in a piece headlined, "In Politically Charged Inquiry, Durham Sought Details About Scrutiny of Clintons." They make this out to be a naked partisan attack on the political archenemies of Trump, the Clintons. But wait a minute. Because however partisan or corrupt the Durham investigation may be, the FBI investigation of Hillary's emails never looked at any of the goddamn emails. It was just this process issue about whether she had used her private server, which was intended to avoid FOIA revelations, and if that private server had any classified information on it. And that was the limited hangout that James Comey set up for his agents. But, this whole Russiagate diversion was a successful attempt, for the most part, in keeping Democrats from actually looking at the emails that were on Hillary's server. And there were a number of them that I have read myself that show improper, if not illegal, collusion between the Secretary of State's office and the Clinton Foundation operations. The most egregious, I've cited this before, is that the Crown Prince of Bahrain wanted to see Hillary Clinton, and in order to grease the process of getting an appointment, he popped $1 million into the Clinton Family Foundation. Lo and behold, 2 days later, or something like that, he got his face-to-face meeting with Hillary Clinton, who then adjusted U.S. policy toward Bahrain in the middle of its mini Arab Spring. And there are other really ugly examples of pay-to-play, of insider back-scratching that occurred while Hillary was Secretary of State and the Clinton Foundation, for example, was operating a relief operation in Haiti. And so these are legitimate issues. But here, this is in a news column of the New York Times, and they write that Durham's investigators are looking for violations in the Clinton Foundation investigation. Quote, "The approach is highly unusual, according to people briefed on the investigation. Though the suspected crimes themselves are not comparable, one involves a possible conspiracy between a presidential campaign and a foreign adversary to interfere in an election, and the other involves potential bribery and corruption." Well, nobody said they're exactly the same. I mean, that's a straw man argument that they are attacking there. Another quote here, "Right-wing news media and prominent Republicans and Peter B. Collins have long promoted a narrative that the FBI's leadership and the Justice Department of the Obama administration were biased in favor of Hillary Clinton. They have accused agents and prosecutors of aggressively investigating Trump while moving more cautiously on allegations of corruption at the Clinton Foundation." So I find this fascinating, and I don't know if Bill Barr and John Durham are going to be able to spring a report or a preliminary report or anything damaging before the election, but I'm pretty sure they're doing everything they can to achieve that. Over in Florida, the effort to maintain voter suppression against ex-felons who are granted the right to vote by a voter initiative, and then blocked by a Republican legislative move that declared that they actually couldn't get cleared to vote until they'd paid all their fines and fees. Then enter Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire from New York, who had a disastrous campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination this year. He has raised $16 million to pay off some of those fines, and he's made it clear they're not asking who you're going to vote for, what your party affiliation is. They're just paying off some of the fines to enable people to register to vote, and they're almost $750,000 Floridians who are in that category. So now the Attorney General of Florida, you want to guess her party affiliation? Ashley Moody, a Republican, is reviewing the matter at the request of the Republican governor, Ron DeSantis. They appear ready to launch an investigation into Bloomberg's allegedly buying votes for the Democrats in Florida. Chris Wray is the FBI director, and he's got it tough. He was appointed by Trump, and he does try to, I think, strike a balance. But he ends up, straddling, speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So he told senators today that the United States has not experienced large-scale voter fraud by mail or other means. Said, yeah, it'd be a major challenge for a foreign country to attempt that. It's what Trump fantasizes about. Michigan Senator Gary Peters, a Democrat, pressed Wray about claims made by Trump and his supporters that foreign interests could interfere with the election by sending in bogus mail-in ballots. We have not historically seen any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in a major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise, said Wray. But he's going to keep a lookout. And he also was asked about Antifa. He said, let me try to be as clear as I can. Antifa is a real thing. It's not a fiction. We've seen organized tactical activity at the local regional level. But he cautioned that many of the people, or at least some of them, who may be involved in violence have a mishmash or a salad bar of ideologies. So, again, he's trying to appease both parties, and he just hopes he's still the FBI director when the dust settles in January. And speaking of those mail-in ballots and the slowdown at the Postal Service, new documents revealed to the Washington Post a PowerPoint presentation from a meeting of top executives in July show that David Williams, the chief of logistics and processing operations, essentially gave the orders that trucks had to leave on schedule, even if they left mail behind, that those sorting machines should be removed, and that overtime should be cut. Well, he said those were just kind of a pep rally, and it was the lower-level people who actually implemented these changes. Well, the memo shows that that is false. Now to the coverage of the extradition hearing at the Old Bailey in London for Julian Assange. We first take a look at Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof, his coverage. And he is referring to the Wednesday session here. WikiLeaks founder Assange was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism, while detained in the Belmarsh high-security prison in London. And according to a psychiatrist who testified, it likely increases his risk of suicide if confined in a restrictive prison in the United States. And this is Dr. Quinton Deely, who we talked a little bit about yesterday. He had interviewed Assange for 6 hours this past July. And Assange told the psychiatrist he feared he would be held in isolation in a U.S. prison. He was afraid of the fresh indictment. He was also concerned about the fate of Joshua Schulte, who was held in harsh confinement prior to his trial for allegedly disclosing the Vault 7 materials to WikiLeaks. And so Gosztola reports that there are precedents here. In the cases of Laurie Love and Gary McKinnon, Love, a hacker, McKinnon, described as the biggest military computer hack artist of all time, their extradition from Britain was blocked because they are autistic. Gosztola quotes from Edward Fitzgerald, who represents Assange and also represented Love. The mere fact of extradition and detention in the United States would be likely to lead to a serious deterioration in the mental health of Mr. Love. To the extent that suicide was prevented by Mr. Love being placed on suicide watch, the conditions in which he would be held on suicide watch or in segregation would lead to a serious and permanent deterioration of his mental health, which is also related to his physical health. Then to Craig Murray's report, and he apologizes to his readers, but he said that he is not going to air out all of the details of the testimony about the psychiatric condition of Julian Assange. But he said that he has talked with Julian's father, John, and that it's no secret to the family or those who know Assange that he does have Asperger's. But Murray is focused most on the biased judge in the case, Vanessa Baratzer. He writes, on Wednesday, the trap sprang shut, as the judge insisted that witnesses must finish next week, that no time will be permitted for preparation of closing arguments, which must be heard the immediate following Monday. And defense attorney Fitzgerald pointed out that there had been numerous witnesses whose evidence had to be taken into account. The written closing submissions had to be physically prepared with reference to the transcripts and other supporting evidence. But the judge said, look, you gave me a 200-page opening argument, and I don't think much more is needed. And I'll continue in the voice of Craig Murray. It has been clear to me from day one that I'm watching a charade unfold. It is not in the least a shock to me that Baratzer does not think anything beyond the written opening arguments has any effect. I have again and again reported to you that where rulings have to be made, she has brought them into court pre-written before hearing the arguments presented. I strongly expect, says Murray, the final decision was made in this case before even opening arguments were received. He also notes that he believes he is being shadow banned by Twitter and Facebook. He says, normally about 50% of my blog readers come from Twitter, 40% from Facebook. During the trial, it has been 3% from Twitter, 9% from Facebook. And I would believe that. There is very little on my Facebook feed about Julian Assange, and even less appearing in the mainstream media in this country. So I will shift to the closing remarks in his blog post of Craig Murray. He said that, he goes through this daily routine, that in the court they are calmly discussing how definitely it will kill Julian Assange if he is sent to the Supermax ADX prison in Colorado. He says, then I go back to my hotel room, type it all up, and post it. The governments who are destroying Julian have, through their agencies, pushed the huge corporations who now control the major internet traffic gateways to ensure my pain and grieving account is seen by very few. My screams of pain and horror are deadened by thick padded walls. We are all locked in. And ConsortiumNews.com is the place that has the most extensive coverage of the Assange hearings. Joe Lauria watched the proceedings here on Thursday, and the presentation was from a prosecution witness who is a forensic psychiatrist for Britain's National Health Service and whose role was to minimize the testimony of the doctors who testified before him. And Blackwood, his name, Nigel Blackwood, said Assange was not at high risk of suicide, as Dr. Michael Koppelman had said, that he's suffering from moderate, not severe depression. He said, I think there's some risk of suicide, but it's been carefully managed in Belmarsh, and the risk factors are modifiable. So that's to be expected. This is not a fair and transparent proceeding, as you have heard eloquently from Craig Murray. So at one point, Fitzgerald, the lawyer for Assange, produced a prison document regarding an event where Julian Assange apparently expressed some suicidal tendencies. And they had said that there was no record of that. And then Fitzgerald produced a prison document that said that at 2:30 p.m. on a specific day, Assange was sent to the medical ward, and the document noted that he was exhibiting a risk of self-harm. And flashing anger for the first time, Fitzgerald spoke over Blackwood, demanding to know why Blackwood hadn't put that in his report. And Judge Baratzer interjected that the witness should be allowed to finish his answer. Blackwood said there were multiple factors for why he was sent to the medical ward, and essentially broke down to admit that Assange's thoughts of self-harm was one of them. And yes, he had neglected to mention that in his report. Also, I want to recommend when you drop by Consortium News, read Joe Laria's piece that explains the expansive frame of the American Espionage Act from 1917. And he relates a series of incidents from 1961 when a congressman named Richard Poff made 3 attempts and was successful the third time to eliminate a clause from the Espionage Act that limited it to the jurisdiction of the United States on the high seas and within the country. And that basically expanded to the point that they argue that the Espionage Act, can cover a non-American whose alleged crimes didn't happen in the United States, threaten to bring him here for trial and lock him up for life. I want to recommend the latest investigative piece under the byline of Ben Norton at the Gray Zone Project. It is a detailed look at a propaganda operation that was paid for by Britain and the United States and primarily used communications firms, or PR flacks, from the United Kingdom. And it relates to their work to influence world opinion about the war in Syria. And in particular, one of these groups, which is called ARK, A-R-K, was front and center in popularizing the white helmets, in promoting their role as this benign civil defense organization that always happened to be there to claim that chemical agents were used, even when the evidence didn't support it. And so this is quite an expose based on documents leaked to the media from someone in Britain. And it details this company, ARK, it stands for Analysis, Research, Knowledge, the role they played in promoting the array of organizations in Syria, including rebranding the Supreme Military Council as the Free Syrian Army. You know, those moderates that Obama was desperate to promote and fund and who melted away when they were put into a combat situation. It details the array of media tools. They had 97 video stringers across Syria, 23 writers, 49 distributors, 23 photographers, 19 trainers, 8 training centers. I mean, this was a huge propaganda machine. And the documents that are published with the article offer strong validation of the claims that you'll read. News from Germany that Alexei Navalny, who's described as Putin's biggest opponent politically in Russia, has been released from the hospital, and they say that he could make a full recovery from poisoning attributed to a highly toxic nerve agent described as from the Novichok class. Navalny says he intends to return to Russia once he's made a full recovery. And of course, Russia has maintained it played no role in the poisoning. But German authorities and others say there's no doubt that the Russian government was behind it. And as I did in the case of the Skripals, the father and daughter, who allegedly were on the receiving end of Novichok on the doorknob of their Salisbury, England home, I remain skeptical because this could be a false flag operation. Now, it also could have been orchestrated by Putin. But when you look hard, and I have a report here from an organization I'd never heard of, but I'm going to post it and share it with you. It's from SyrianPropagandaMedia.org, and the author is named as Paul McKeague. And in an academic style, he takes us through the history of Novichok. And what's fascinating here is that it is believed that in order to test whether one of the agents of Russia had flipped and become a double agent, they fed him the story that Russia has Novichok supplies. They're referred to as binary nerve agents. And when he didn't leak that, they determined that he was still on their side. The other fact we need to cite is that in 2008, the ingredients, the formula, the recipe for Novichok nerve agent, it was published in a book that is widely available. And so let me again underscore that I don't really know how Alexei Navalny was sickened. And I do not discount that it could have been a Russian operation. But we also have to examine whether another actor, like the CIA, has stocks of Novichok, which they deploy when they want to embarrass Russia and create an incident where Russia is blamed. And so I invite you to take a look at this. Again, I don't consider it definitive. I can't vouch for the source, but it does present a compelling argument. Here's today's COVID-19 update prepared by Linda Lewis with my appreciation. And today in the United States, we show 1,091 new coronavirus deaths reported and about 41,500 new cases. Axios reports the coronavirus is surging once again across the U.S., with cases rising in 22 states over the past week. We're now averaging 43,000 new cases a day, a 16% increase from last week. The biggest increases are in the West and Midwest, though Maine and New Jersey have seen their new infections tick up. The hot spots continue to be Arizona, Colorado, Minnesota, Montana, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming, where daily infection rates rose by 60% over the past week. We currently have 29,000 people hospitalized across the country, 6,100 in ICUs, and 1,545 on ventilators. So I don't consider those to be alarming numbers, but they are substantial. And the COVID-19 virus is continuing to mutate, with experts believing it's probably becoming more contagious. The new study analyzing 5,000 genetic sequences, which has continued to mutate as it has spread through the population. The study didn't find that the mutations have made it more lethal or changed its effects, but it is concerning. France has raised its COVID-19 alert level in a number of areas across the country, and authorities ramped up restrictions on public gatherings in several cities. The new measures take effect over the next few days, include the total closure of all bars and restaurants in Aix-en-Provence and Marseille, and a ban on public gatherings of more than 10 people in Paris and a handful of other French cities. The positivity rate for the virus has passed 6% in many of those communities. And I will note, based on the latest information that I've seen from our listener Olivier de Merlot, that hospitalizations and fatalities are not climbing at the rate of the new cases that are described. And I am looking to analyze that situation in the United States, and we will share those findings as we pull them all together. On Wednesday, Trump said the White House may or may not approve new FDA guidelines requiring outside experts to weigh in before the agency approves a coronavirus vaccine. His comments came after 4 of the administration's top health officials testified in a Senate hearing. The officials told the panel they had complete faith in the agency, that science and data, not politics, are guiding its decisions. But that is not apparent through many of the stunts that we've seen in recent weeks of the revision by the White House task force of CDC-generated reports and standards. 2 prominent groups of scientists who regularly advise the government warned of alarming political interference in the work of scientists. The statement by the leaders of the National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Medicine came a day after Trump suggested he might reject that FDA proposal to raise standards for emergency use of any vaccine. The statement said, "We find ongoing reports and incidents of the politicization of science, particularly the overriding of evidence and advice from public health officials, to be alarming," and it certainly is. Some of the testimony came from Anthony Fauci, CDC head Robert Redfield, Brett Giroir, who is the Health and Human Services vaccine guy, and Stephen Hahn of the FDA. Fauci noted that a number of individuals who virologically have recovered from infection, in fact, have persistence measured in weeks to months of symptomatology that doesn't appear to be due to persistence of the virus. They're referred to as long haulers. They have fatigue, myalgia, fever, and involvement of the neurological system, as well as cognitive abnormalities such as the inability to concentrate. And, of course, Trump has waved it all away, particularly when it comes to young people. He says almost nobody gets it. Well, nobody that he cares about. And finally, Linda took a look at changes in the state of Texas that they're making to poll and voting procedures in light of the pandemic, and she said that everyone should consult in advance their own state's plan before deciding to vote in person or by mail. She said the Texas Secretary of State website is where one will find COVID resources for election officials, describing changes to procedures specific to coronavirus, and it has an advisory, quote, "An election judge has discretion to ask the voter to temporarily lower or remove their face covering if the judge is not able to determine the voter's identity while wearing that mask. If a voter refuses to temporarily lower or remove the mask and the election judge cannot identify the voter with the mask in place and the ID presented, the voter should be offered a provisional ballot." And we know that many provisional ballots are never counted. So Linda gave me a long list here of websites where you can go to get voting information, and I'm going to cut and paste that into the show file for today's podcast so you can check it out for yourselves. And finally today, Trump's lawyers have responded to the District Attorney of Manhattan, who's investigating financial fraud, insurance fraud, tax fraud by the Trump Organization, that the prosecutors are merely using speculation and innuendo to justify an unfair subpoena seeking 8 years of his tax returns. But let's compare that to a new statement in a lawsuit against Trump and other Trump family members by the niece Mary, who wrote her book that was published about a month ago. And she said that fraud was not just the family business, it was a way of life. She believes she was conned into signing away her interests in the estate of Trump's father, Fred Trump. And she wants her money. She wants to recover the millions of dollars that she says she has lost. And you know, when an ugly family like this is fighting, best thing to do is sit back and just enjoy it. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. I'll be back at you on Monday. You're free to share this all over the place, and you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smile.